Hi, I'm Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and this is the Bonsai Stuff podcast. As always, thanks for coming back and thanks for tuning in and listening to my ramble on Bonsai Stuff. This one's going to be an interesting one. Well, part of it's going to be interesting. Part, I hope, doesn't send you to sleep, but it's a really, really important part. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. So one was an experience that I had in Japan with repotting, and sort of another light bulb moment for me about the importance for speed and accuracy. And I'll go through a bit of a scenario story and a few things I learnt while I was doing that over there. Also want to go and talk about pad development technique that I use, specifically relating to junipers in this instance, but it's something that I get asked a lot about, and that until you've been there, until you've done it, it sort of can seem a bit grey and complex, and it's not really that hard. So I want to talk about that. And then the part that hopefully doesn't send you to sleep, but is probably the most important part of the podcast, I'm going to talk about those pesky animals, spider mites. They seem to be everywhere, always, very hard to control. I want to talk a little bit about them, plus some recommendations, and see what we can do about stopping these mongrels from causing more damage than what they need to. So stick around, it's going to be an interesting podcast. Now, I've like most people in bonsai, I've repotted for a long time. I've repotted a lot of trees. I've been involved with repotting a lot of trees. And up until my time in Japan, seeing it at a commercial level, in a bonsai professional sense, I felt like an amateur. Felt like I had zero experience, and maybe was a bit slack in what I did, and a bit too general in my approach for how I undertook the repotting process. So I actually learned quite a lot from being there in that environment, and being shown things slowly the first time, and then things ramped up pretty quick, and things were expected to be highly accurate, and you're part of a process, a production line, where you need to make sure that what you're doing is the best thing for that tree that's in front of you, but it's done really, really quickly, so you can quickly move on to the next. Because otherwise, I mean, you think about it, at nursery it's got, I don't know, pick a number, say 1,000 trees, and on average you're going to repot 40% of those trees per year, thereabouts. So there's 400 trees that will get repotted that pretty much have a pretty strict window of operation. You've got to repot. For me, and my approach to repotting is something comes out of a dormancy period. So before they start to grow, before they start to release their stored resources and produce new roots, new foliage, all that stuff. So you want to get in and make sure that your repotting is done prior to that. So your window, your time frame for repotting certain species can be pretty strict. And then they've all got to have the appropriate aftercare, and there's got to be space for that, and it's all got to get done perfectly, so the tree doesn't miss a beat. You want the tree to actually take a great leap forward, as opposed to that skipping a beat and going, hang on a minute, you haven't done the right thing here. Now I've got to catch my breath again. I've got to build up my resources. You've treated me poorly, effectively, and you've got to get them back on their feet. So being part of that professional environment, at the time I knew it was important, and I'd chosen repotting time to go and study at IGN, so I could see it and be involved in it and pick up a few what I thought would be tips and tricks. But it's far more than that. It's a whole philosophical approach that I use now to repotting my trees, to make sure that every time I do it, I use a great medium. I spend a lot of time making sure that that's ready to go, and I'm prepared. I've got to have everything, all my ducks lined up in a row before I start that repotting phase of the trees, because it's super important to make sure that you're using the time now. For us in Melbourne, Australia, we're midway through April, midway through our autumn period, and a few months' time, come July, for me, that's when my repotting starts. So my activity, my preparation work, making sure that I've got everything ready to go, starts now. So when I get to that point in July, I don't turn around and go, geez, I really wish I had more pumice, or I wish I had this, I wish I had that. Like, it's now I'm getting all the stuff. I made a big list. My whiteboard's got a big thing on it. I'm ticking them off as I get them one by one. Yep, got that. What else do you need? Do you need pots? How many trees are you going to be repotting? So I start to build a requirement list for myself for my time that I need to be able to put into these trees. There's no point saying, okay, I'm going to repot over 3 days. This is the Friday, Saturday, Sunday I'm going to be doing my repotting over, and suddenly I look at it and there's, 150 trees that have got to get done. Well, it's like, there's no way that you're going to get that done in that period of time. And to the level that I expect them to be repotted at, you might cut corners and you might just, whatever, slap it inches, right, off you go. But then there's a price to pay for doing that somewhere down the track. And that's what I learned from this trip in Japan, was that it's you can be incredibly fast, but you can be incredibly accurate as well. And that speed doesn't come at the expense of the structure of the bonsai. There's so many things that can go wrong when you repot. And I'm not just talking about the root system. I'm talking about damage to the tree itself, damage to the bark, and how you handle a tree when you're repotting it to make sure that you're not causing, collateral damage to another part of the tree, laying it on its side, damaging branches, Is it a big tree? Do you need two people to help? One to hold, one to rake, And seriously, little things like eye protection. For many times when I first started, living with a bit of grit in my eye for a couple of days after repotting was what I thought was normal. But then, safety goggles. I know it's not rocket science, and I probably should have worked it out a lot sooner than what I did. But having stuff like that, your gloves that you use to protect your hands as well. Repotting 1 or 2 trees, no problems. Get dirty fingers, scrub it off you go. You'll be right. But when you're using coarse grit, that can take its toll on your hands. And at the end of, I repot over 2 months. So July and August is my time for repotting down here in Melbourne. And at the end of that time, without using gloves, my hands are torn to shreds. They're cracked, they're ripped, they're, nails look like they've been run along concrete. But by making sure that I'm prepared and I'm getting all that stuff now means that I know when it comes time to repot, I can just jump straight into it, lock myself away, do the process, and set up almost like a production line, which is what I also learned in Japan, was be very efficient at each step of the cycle. So, whether it's pot preparation, putting the pot mesh in the bottom of the pot, what's the most efficient way to get that so you can lock that mesh in there? What size wire should you use to hold that mesh in there? Not because it's the easiest for you to use, but it's the one that's going to last 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the bottom of the pot without being, ripped out every time you pick up that pot and get your fingers caught in the wire underneath. How long does the wire need to be when it goes through the holes to lock down? Your tie-in wires, what size wire are you going to be using for that based on the size tree, the size pot? And I found that my time in Japan going through this repotting was, instead of looking at the whole picture of repotting, look at one segment of it and get that part perfect. Then go on to the next part, then go on to the next part, then go on to the next part. Whether it's soil preparation first, you're going to sieve your soil. If you're going to sieve it, start sieving. Start getting the fines out of it now. If that's what you want to do, by all means, go ahead and do it, but make sure it's ready to go. So on the day, you don't get your tree, take it out of the pot, start smashing apart the roots, and then go, ooh, hang on a minute. I didn't sieve that soil. Hang on, I'll just leave the tree there sitting on the bench and I'll go and sieve that soil, then I'll come back in 10, 15 minutes. It's like, that's not the most efficient way to do things. You've got to make sure that you're on track with things. And I think about it like, a production line for making a car, right? They start with what looks like nothing, a shell, and they add bits and pieces to it all along the way. So when it comes off the production line, it's perfect. It's rolling, it's a car. But at the start, it doesn't look like that. And for me, I'm not trying to dramatise repotting, but it's all in the preparation. It's the skill of it comes in your preparation and making sure that there's no stress when that time comes around, and just making sure that each part of that process is perfect. I was told a long time ago, and I've said it on the podcast before, that bonsai is about the detail. It's the little things. It's the 1%ers that make such a big difference. And when you tie your trees in, the technique that you use to tie your trees in should have it so that tree doesn't move. So there's zero movement on that tree. Not that it's strangled into the pot, but you want to make sure that those roots, the new roots that grow, the fine, delicate ones that are so easy to break, you look at them funny and they break. You don't want any movement in that tree. And that's a technique, that's a skill, but it's definitely something that you can learn. With bonsai, often a lot of the problems that we come across is the lack of availability of repetition of activities, right? So repotting's once a year. It can be more than that, but let's say the window for repotting comes once a year. That varies obviously where you are. I know there's always going to be differences, but for me, let's say there's one primary repotting season of the year, and if you're only doing one tree a year, then it's very easy to forget the learned lessons from the past. And let's say it's a tree that only gets repotted every 3 or 4 years, then there's a long time between drinks to make sure that your technique is correct. For me, I find it's a lot easier because it's repetitive every year. There's hundreds of trees that have to get repotted in one shape or another. Mine, customers, helping customers repot, whatever it is. But I get that repetition of time doing the same task over and over and over, and it's like riding a bike for me. It comes back very, very quickly. But I do appreciate that it's not always easy for other people to get that availability of repetition, but it's so super important to make sure that, one, that you're prepared. Secondly, you've got your timing all set out, and do the things like making sure you've got the fine detail correct. If you need to practice a few times before you do it, get a block of wood and try and tie that into a pot. Set up the pots with the mesh and the tie-in wires well before you plan to do the repotting. If you're going to be changing, a pot for the bonsai, if it's in the same pot, obviously you can't do it. But there's always a way that you can practice and you can improve your techniques, but it's the real fine detail, and break it down to each segment along the way. Make sure you're covered. Have you got a sickle that's going to help you take the pot out? Have you got a root rake? Have you got a thicker root rake? Have you got a root hook if you need it? Have you got your chopsticks ready so you can use it to settle the new soil medium in between the roots once the tree's ready to go? Have you got sphagnum moss for the top of it? Is the sphagnum moss chopped up? Where are you going to put the tree afterwards? How long is it going to be kept there for? Are you going to use a product like, a seaweed, sea salt type scenario to help the tree, recover and build strength after it's been repotted? There's so much to think about that. This podcast is designed to be a catalyst for improvement and for everyone listening to be able to jump, make quantum leaps with their bonsai by me repetitively saying the same thing in the same way that you can sort of pick up on it and use it. And the big message from this one, if you haven't guessed, is repotting season's coming, and you've got to get ready. The aim with this podcast is to be topical, to bring up things that relate to a lot of people. There's going to be some specific stuff along the way, but when I was thinking about, I try and make it that it's also a seasonal thing, that it's something that's relative now. And I try and factor in the Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere thing as well when I sort of plan for this podcast. And something like a light bulb went off for me, saying, well, here's something that we can all get involved with, and it's spider mites. They are notorious. They are everywhere. They are very hard to get rid of. So I thought, well, let's do a segment on the podcast. Try and not bore people to death as they're heading on to work, or you're out for a run or whatever it is. Just focus on whatever it is you're doing. If you're operating heavy machinery, if your eyes feel droopy, maybe turn the podcast off. But no, seriously, these things are a shocker, and it doesn't seem to matter how aggressively you attack these things. They always seem to have an impact. All right, so I wanted to go through, talk about what they are, why they can become a problem for us with bonsai, and then a bit of a story about coming across them in the nursery in Japan. Also, it was funny actually. I'd written down I was going to be discussing spider mites and done some research and looked at Wikipedia and got some info, and then I was flicking through my notes on Japan, and there's one section on the following year's trip, so in 2016, where it just happened to be autumn when I got over there, which is perfect timing for where we are here, and spider mites had done damage. And I looked through my notes, and there was pages and pages of notes about spider mites in there and how they tended to tackle it, and it was just like, wow, that's just meant to be. I was going to talk about him anyway, but now I've got a scenario where I can talk about it and see how a professional nursery in Japan would handle the same scenario. So these spider mites are tiny, all right? These are facts that I'm getting from Wikipedia. So this is not me getting out a ruler or anything like that and measuring them, but they're less than a millimetre in size, which is, they're very hard to see. Often you see them as very fine webbing, like super, super fine webbing on your trees. See them a lot in black pines. Or I see them a lot where there's clusters of growth. All right? They love hot, dry conditions. Always love hot, dry conditions. And it's notorious when I get presented with a juniper, and they look at it and go, hey, there's damage to this foliage. What is it? I can't work it out. And there's all this webbing over it. It's like, it's spider mites. It has to be. And then when I talk to them, I can say, okay, let's talk about, how you look after your bonsai. What do you do? And it's like, okay, what do you want me to start with? And it's like watering. How do you water your junipers? I water the base. It's like, yeah, but okay, so if you water the foliage now, understanding that they love hot, dry conditions, then that helps naturally drive spider mites out of that environment because they don't like it being moist. They don't like it being wet. Their prime location they want to go to is somewhere where it's very hot, very dry, which is where the crackly bark becomes a bit of a nightmare on a lot of our trees. As they start to age, we look at it and go, that's magnificent. I love it. Look at that bark. And spider mites love it as well. They get in there and go, well, there's never going to get water on that thing, so let's build a nest in here. So these are, and this is why they can jump away. And I find preventative treatments work reasonably well with this sort of. And I'm focusing purely on spider mites here. And I understand that there's a section of the bonsai community that don't like chemicals. That's cool. I'm all for not using chemicals as well. If you have to use chemicals, you've got to make sure that they're socially responsible, environmentally responsible as well. That they are the right thing. So I'll get that proviso out of the way now, and I'll continue talking about. But from a preventative point of view, I find that I don't wait for damage to appear from spider mites because I know they're going to be there. I know they are. I know they are just hanging around and waiting. And when you hear these facts about how quickly they can spread, then you can find that really they can get out of control very, very quickly. And then trying to pull the reins in on these things can be an absolute nightmare. So just keep in the back of your mind while I'm talking about this, about preventative treatments for spider mites as opposed to reactive treatments, right? So spider mites, the eggs hatch in about 3 days. They become sexually mature in as little as 5 days. All right, so that's an 8-day turnaround. From when they're laid to when they're laying eggs is only 8 days. That's a week. Put it down as 1 week, right? So 1 week of not actively looking at your tree means that one spider mite, one female, can lay up to 20 eggs per day, right? And that female lives for 2 to 4 weeks. So when you start getting a calculator on these things, those numbers grow at an exponential rate. They grow rapidly fast and can do one tiny little, less than 1 mil in size, one little bug can sort of evolve to be unchecked on a weak tree. They can make a hell of a lot of damage, and that's the thing too, that which I'm going to talk about a little bit later on, is that the strength of your tree comes into this a lot, and how you do so much more with bonsai. Like I've talked about it till I'm blue in the face. I feel like I talk about it every day, and I hate to drone on about it, but the strength of your bonsai is the key to your success and longevity with your tree, right? So if you've got an outbreak of these things, trees can naturally defend it, or they've got enough foliage there that's fine. I look at my black pines, getting into black pine season now, autumn, winter, needle plucking, bud selecting, whatever. So you're looking at the old needles that are a year, 2 years old in some cases, And you look for spider mite damage on them and go, yeah, there's spider mite damage, there's spider mite damage. The tree's beautiful and healthy. You know, you step back, 30 centimetres from the tree, a foot back from the tree, you have a look at it and go, it looks lovely. You get in close, pluck a needle, get it out with a magnifying glass and have a look and go, yeah, there's damage there. Like spider mites are on this thing, but the tree can survive, in conjunction with these things. And that's really what it should do. In the wild or in the real world, these things have to coexist. It's when you get a tree that's on the weaker side that these spider mites come into, then that's when you can see that you're paddling up a creek without a canoe. You're not going to get there. It's going to be a never-ending battle that you're never going to win with, and you need to take action to try and prevent it. So spider mites can be one of those ones that get out of control very, very, very quickly. Part of my my resource area, my library, my bonsai library, other than having a million magazines and books, I'm just turning my head to have a look at it now. It's just overflowing with information. But one of the things, it's my go-to, it's his book on pest and disease, specifically with Australian plants, and I love it. When I get someone coming in, oh, what's this, what's that? It's Google's great, and you can find answers there, but there's nothing like flicking through the pages of a book. Like seriously, I used to have a printing company. I got a thing for ink on paper. It's lovely. It's there. It's long term. Yeah, sure, it can become outdated and it can be replaced quickly with new techniques and whatever. But I don't know, something about it. Anyway, so reading from this book, when I looked up spider mites, I was doing this research, and it was like, yeah, okay, well, how do spider mites work? Like, where does the damage come from? What is it that they're doing? And I know that they bite, they feed off the tree, but what is it that they're actually doing? So what they do is they feed by piercing the leaf tissue, and they basically puncture the tissue, and then they suck on the sap that oozes out. All right, so they're effectively taking the lifeblood of the tree and they're feeding on it. That's how they live, it sounds disgusting, but this book also goes on to talk about that a lot of plant cells can be damaged and destroyed in a really short period of time when you've got an army of these mites feeding at one time. And the affected leaves, they take on this dry appearance and become silvery over time and mottled and pale yellow in patches. And that's sort of how you can tell that they've done it. On pine needles, it's like little yellow dots or around the needles, and it's something which is very hard to control. They get out of control really quickly during the long, hot, dry spells. So when you go through a summer period where there's not much rain, that's when they seem to take off. And even I was reading, which was interesting, when you go through the tropics, they have the two seasons, the wet and the dry. At the end of the winter and start of the spring, that's when spider mites can have an effect up in those areas as well. So, like I said, this issue of spider mites is something which we all have to deal with our bonsai in one way or another, and it's something that you definitely can't put your head in the sand over. They talk about them becoming more prevalent in areas where there's greater protection, and this is where the bell went off in my head, because there's a real thing about bonsai being protected and sheltered, and it's a bonsai, it's special. It's special. It can't be in the exposed areas. It can't get that strong wind. Can't get the rain. It's got to be in a nice corner somewhere, and it's in those areas where the rain doesn't hit it naturally, where it's protected, where it's sheltered, that spider mites get in there and rapidly multiply and take over and do the most damage. So getting your bonsais into the open air, into the full blast of nature is a great thing to do. And this is another reason why, these infestations of spider mites don't happen quite as frequently when they're in those environments. And when this book that I refer to for these pests isn't specifically related to bonsai at all, but they do make a note in there that often plants that should have been repotted but haven't been, therefore become weaker, the root system starts to struggle, they generally get attacked a lot more by spider mites, which I thought that's really interesting, because that's exactly what happens with our trees in pots. We probably leave them a year or 2 years longer. We don't get that strong growth. The tree's health starts to suffer. The cycle starts to slow down, and that's when pests move in, whether it's aphids, spider mites, whatever it is, and that's where our action needs to be taken. And spider mites are an easy one to put into a bracket, saying this is spider mites, but there's apparently over 1,200 species of spider mites, and I've read that there's still thousands more of these things to be identified. So they're prevalent, they're everywhere, and it's not something that you can stick your head in the sand over. Now, there are good spider mites. I accept that, but I'm only talking about the spider mites that get in and do damage to our bonsai. That's specifically what this discussion's about. But anyway, so I wanted to now jump into the scenario or the circumstance that saw me back at IGN, and just talk about the spider mite damage there. So I arrived back there in autumn in 2016, so it was late October, start of November, and I had a walk around the garden, as is my wont when I first get there, to have a look around, and I was absolutely gobsmacked as to how many trees had been damaged by spider mites in this 1 year. And I spoke to Hayakata and said, what's happened? There's an outbreak, and he said, he blames himself because he believes that they weren't watered heavily enough during the summer period. They were the watering was a bit light on, and that caused the trees to then get a little bit weaker. And once they started getting weaker, spider mites came in and did their damage, and they didn't pick up on it until it was too late. So he said it was weird because it wasn't something that was on the radar as a result of it being quite a humid summer, and the spider mites like the dry, as I just said before. So they had this scenario where the trees have been underwater, they started getting weaker, they thought that they were okay with spider mites being an issue because of the humidity, but the spider mites got in and did the damage anyway. So therefore, the trees had a lot of damage on them. So I said, okay, well, what's the go now? What are you doing? And because it's autumn and it's perfect time for us here in Australia, especially in the cooler states, where our trees now are starting to head towards a dormancy period. What they were doing there in Japan, as they were heading towards their quiet time, was they had upped the fertilizer like crazy. So there'd been a spray of chemicals. I couldn't find out. I couldn't determine exactly what had been used to spray for the mites, but they'd taken action to try and reduce the number of spider mites immediately, but then worked on the primary cause, which is the overall strength and health of the trees. And what they were doing is they'd put a massive amount of fertilizer on their trees during the autumn period, far more than I'd ever seen before at that time of year. And they had, I made a note saying that some of the trees had 8 to 10 bags of fertilizer put on there every month just to try and pick up that strength as much as they could. And they were fertilised a week apart, so they kept ploughing new fertiliser onto these things. And the idea was that they'd get super strong when spring comes around and they'd push off. The other thing that they had, because of this strength issue that they were encountered, the black pines a lot of them hadn't been decandled. So everything had skipped a year because it had lost a lot of strength overall in a lot of areas of the garden. This isn't just one tree. This is hundreds and hundreds of trees that sort of were in that predicament that they weren't, in the best condition. So once they started to, and I gave you the stats before about how quickly these things multiply and how quickly they can spread. It's like a perfect storm. You've got a batch of really dry trees that maybe aren't in peak fitness, that are somewhat, reduced in their natural defences, and you've got a pest that multiplies rapidly and thrives in an environment like that, and all of a sudden, you're facing an uphill battle as to how to fix these things. And it's not that it couldn't be repaired, like it wasn't that it was game over, we're done. It was just really interesting that that this had happened in a professional environment, and it made me feel okay. It sounds funny, I know, but I thought if these guys that live and breathe bonsai 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, they never stop. If an issue like this can get under their radar, then it's okay for the rest of us. We can have it too. But I think understanding that if you do get your bonsai to a certain point in their strength, their health, then you are going to encounter these sort of issues a lot more. And for me, my approach is always to be on the front foot, to always take preventative action. Yeah, sure, there are times, I'll put my hand up saying, yep, there's times where I should have repotted, didn't repot. Then there's going to be more times in the future where that happens as well, because that's just the way that I work with trees when I'm trying to slow down their ramification, maybe hold off a year longer than what I possibly should. The trees then get a little bit weaker, but I try and pride myself to do that daily viewing of the trees, try and look at each of them and assess, hey, has anything changed from yesterday? Is anything changed from last week? Is this tree getting weaker? What do I have to be on top of to make sure that this doesn't become an issue for us down the track? Where do I get in and stop this? And it's not just spider mites. Spider mites at that stage in Japan at Achien were like the catalyst to say, well, we need to be aware that the trees are weaker, they've been attacked by spider mites, so therefore fungal issues can start creeping into these trees as well. You've got these trees which are basically having they've been underwatered, getting weaker, they're getting their sap sucked by these spider mites, and they've got so many open wounds effectively that the fungal issues are bound to happen. If there's fungal spores around those trees and they can't naturally defend them and they've got all these open wounds everywhere, then fungal issues certainly have to happen. So you need to, what these guys did was they increased the watering frequency and they increased the feeding frequency, and they said that, the strong trees were okay, but anything that was on the slightly weaker side got tipped downhill very, very quickly. So it's one of those things, be on the front foot with it. And there's miticide sprays you can get. There's definitely some systemic things that you can use. I'm sure there's natural remedies out there as well. The point of the timeliness of this is to say, hey, look, if it can happen in autumn in Japan, it can happen in autumn anywhere, really. So just be mindful of it. Look for what that damage looks like. Consult some people in your local area about how to tackle that best, and be on the front foot. And for me, my approach is always preventative. Calendar date comes around, right? Get out there, look for pests, do whatever it is that you're going to do to try and stop them in future. And then if they do get an outbreak, at least it's not going to be something which is going to take you a mile backwards with your tree's development. It's going to mean that you can still keep going in the right direction, which is what we all want, right? So spider mites are one of those things. Can't get rid of them, have to live with them, have to understand how quickly they can become a problem, and they're not something to, you don't just look at your trees once a week, because these things in a week's time there can be millions of them on your tree. And, just make sure that your environment that you're keeping your trees in, it's just it's a reinforcement of what I said for years, that, our environment we keep our trees in is going to have a massive part to play on their health and longevity and our happiness as practicing artists of the art of bonsai. Righto, let's move on from spider mite, shall we, and talk about pad development. Now, this is specifically in relation to junipers, because it's something that I get asked a lot about. And but how do I develop a pad? How do you get from this shoot to something that looks like let's call it a cloud, right? How do I get from a shoot to a cloud? Like, how do I develop that pad structure along the way? So I broke it into three steps. And the 3 steps come over a period of time, right? So it's don't take these 3 steps and think, yep, righto, there's 2 weeks later I've got perfect pads. It can take years. It can take a long time to develop this stuff. But like with going from development to refinement, this is part of the process. And if you're looking at pad development, then you go from the development side to the refinement stage over a period of time. That's the realistic expectation. Don't expect it to happen overnight, but it does happen. It's one of those things that we do get to with our bonsais when we refine them nicely. One of the big flaws I see with pads, or one of the hurdles that a lot of people can't get past, is if you look at it from the top down. A lot of people can very easily make a pad that is flat like your hand, like a saucer, right? You can come out, you can get the round shape, you can get the structure for it, but it remains flat because you got told somewhere along the way in your bonsai journey, cut anything going up and cut anything going down. And yeah, I agree with the underneath stuff, no worries. I'm not going to go over that again. But the stuff on the top is what gives us our volume. That's what gives us our pad. That's what gives us our cloud, right? So your pruning practices on all of your trees, you've got to have some kind of volume in your pad. So step one is you go for that shape that you want, the flat saucer, like your hand sticking out with your fingers sticking out, that shape. But you want something in the middle that's going to give you volume on your trees. Right, so getting back to junipers, the 3 stages, right? The 3 stages of pad development in a juniper is, 1, you let a runner extend. All right, so one of these little shoots that gets the tips start to grow on it, just let it shoot out. Let it continue to grow. You take that once it's starting to brown up, which could be a couple of years, and put wire on it, and you position that branch with the long tip on it, so it then starts to set in place that you want, right? Then, once you've got that branch to be long enough / thick enough that you want, and by this stage, some of the secondary branches have started to develop along that runner, right? So it's gone from being a long, thin shoot to now it's starting to get a little bit broader. The second stage is to come in and cut back the tip of the runner, right? So that gives you the limit on the length of your pad, and by this stage, you've got some of the width starting to happen with your pad division. So with the juniper, I do the maintenance in summer, so let's call it summer maintenance for my junipers. That's when I go through and I start pruning things and start to work on cleaning the underneath, but start to work on that stuff, the volume in the middle, right? Very, very simple. Stage 2 is don't prune too much of the weak and prune more of the strong. So it's that set of scales that we're trying to balance up always, right? So you'll find that you've taken the tip off the runner, so the pad length has been created away from the trunk. Then we're starting to create our circle shape, whatever shape it is you want for your pad as a flat saucer. And then we're trying to start creating our volume on our pad. So step 2 is to make sure that we start to balance the strong with the weak inside the pad itself. So the ones that start to shoot off, that start to get long runners, we cut those. The ones that don't have the long runners on them, the weaker ones, just leave them alone, right? Let them start to catch up to the stronger ones. So we hold the strong back and we encourage the weak to continue to grow. Then step 3, which is the easy part, once we've got our shape and structure right. So we've got our length away from the trunk of the pad set. We've got our round shape or rounded shape or whatever shape the top-down view of the pad set as well. Then we start to work on through the second stage, the volume of the pad. So that's the height of the pad, looking at it from the side on, not from the top, but from the side, when you start to see how the raised mound of the pad, how it flows down towards the edges. So step 3 is just remove the runners that extend beyond the cloud. All right? So that's your pad set. Simple. 3 stages. 1, use the runner to create the main structure for your pad. When it's long enough, remove the tip of it. Second is, during your summer maintenance, work on the strong that start to extend out and prune those back and leave the weak and allow them to grow and catch up. Stage 3, once you've got the pad set, anything that it starts extending beyond the pad's structure that you want, so don't let the pad continue to get bigger and bigger and bigger. You go back and you prune it back. You take out those longer ones and leave the weaker ones that are inside the pad volume, and then they will start to grow somewhere in the future. Then you prune those ones back as well, and that's pretty much it. That's as easy as it is to set a pad on a juniper and to develop it. The time frame's the thing that gets frustrating. You know, that it's that want for an instant pad where I find that maybe you then start, stage 2 is to leave the weak and prune the strong. Often when you're looking at it going, but I want it to be perfect now. Like, why isn't it, if I just cut these ones back as well, then my shape will be perfect. And that's where pinching comes into it too. People will, you'll see a lot of pinching happening on pads on junipers because that gives you the perfect shape. But it does so much damage to your structure and to your foliage that it's not worth it. So stage 2 is the one where you've got to be really patient, and stage 3 is when you're there just to maintain it and keep it set into that structure. So that's pad setting in a juniper. 3 easy steps. Simple, huh? That brings us to the end of another podcast. Hope that was enjoyable. Hope the spider mite thing didn't bore you to tears. It is really important, and it's one of those. They're one of those pests that they seem to be there always and always nagging somewhere. They seem to crop up in a conversation at least once a week for me with somebody somewhere around the world. But anyway, that's and the pad setting technique. Hopefully, that's something that sort of can buy you some patience when you're working with your junipers as well, and break it down to a simple, easy format to use too. And the way I want to finish this podcast is to say the world is a small place. I was contacted by someone about promoting or giving a plug to the Rocky Mountain Bonsai Society over in America for an American Bonsai Society 2023 learning seminars in June later this year in 2023. If you are interested, it looks like a great event. Seriously, it'd be nice to be there. And if you want to check out the details for it, no matter where you are around the world, it's worth having a look because it's a learning seminar. It's it's what I plug. It's what we should be doing. The website's rmbonsai.org. It's definitely worth having a look. I know I've seen a lot of stuff there that makes me wish that in June I could be over in the Rocky Mountains. It would be very nice. Anyway, thank you as always for tuning in. It's nice. Make sure that if you do have listened to this and it sparks some interest about these spider mites, that just go and have a look for the damage, and reach out if I can help in any way whatsoever. As always, just via the socials is the nicest way to get hold of me, and I'll do my best as always to stay in touch with you lovely bonsai people out there, anywhere around the world, wherever you are. So take care and give them a smooch for me, and look for little bite marks from those rotten spider mites. Anyway, I'll be back next week in the same format, and until then, happy bonsai.